friends, welcome to this evening's session of Inside Israel 2020, Mitzion Tetzei Torah, Israel in Contemporary Jewish Liturgy. I'm Rabbi Leah Mühlstein. I'm the International Chair of Arzeinu and a rabbi at Northwood and Pinner Liberal Synagogue. And tonight I'm also here as one of the co-editors of the new prayer book for liberal Judaism in the UK. And I'm really happy to be joined by a wonderful panel of colleagues. So with us tonight is Rabbi Professor Dalia Marks. Rabbi Marks is the Rabbi Aaron Pankin Professor of Liturgy and Midrash at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Jerusalem, and the co-editor of the new Israeli Reform prayer book. Hi, Dalia. Also with us is Rabbi Hera Person, the Chief Executive Officer of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, formerly publisher of the CCAR Press. And finally, with us from Luxembourg, Rabbi Alexander Krodensky, the Rabbi of Esch-sur-Alzette, who is here also to represent a little bit the European voice and the non-English, non-Hebrew speaking voice. And maybe Rabbi Alexander will say a little bit more about his personal background because he has many languages to contribute to this conversation. But it's really wonderful to be joined by all of you, my dear friends. And we've agreed we are going to keep this informal. So I've introduced everyone with their correct titles, but I will address them by their first names as I would normally do. So if we're talking about Israel in our prayer book, Rabbi Alexander quite rightly pointed out to me that we need to be a bit specific when we talk about Israel. There are many different ways we can understand Israel. And as today's conversation is about Israel and Zionism, what we probably had in mind was a little bit thinking about Israel as the connection to the land of Israel, also the state of Israel, but also thinking about Israel, the people of Israel, maybe less so Israel as an alternative name for Jacob. And I grew up in Germany in the Reform movement in Germany, or actually as it's known there, the liberal movement in Germany, and later came to England. And if I think about what my background and the prayer books with which I grew up, then we didn't see so much Israel reference in our prayer books anymore. I very much grew up inheriting a tradition of Reform, progressive, liberal Jewish liturgy that wasn't overly focused on Israel. And I think we've seen this around the world. Rabbi Dalia has written an entire essay on this and is really a leading scholar. So I think she can probably say a little bit more about it. But I think where I wanted to start is with a question to Hera, to talk a little bit about the evolution of American Reform Judaism in its shifting attitudes towards Israel, and maybe talk a little bit about starting with Mishkan Tefillah, but also Mishkan HaNefesh, the Machzor, to share a little bit examples with us of how that shifting relationship to Israel plays out in our prayer book. So Hera, over to you first.
Hi, thank you, Leah. And we've had a very interesting shift here, really, and I would say in the last 15 years in terms of publications, right? So not in terms of what necessarily people believe or think or identify, but in terms of sort of the official imprimatur that comes with what's in our Siddur. And which that statement actually by itself is can be unpacked because, right, we never called it a Siddur until really pretty recently. So why don't we start with the slides and we'll walk through those. Can we do that? Okay. Yep. There we go. Coming. Can we go back to the beginning? Okay, thank you. So here we have our publication, Mishkan Tefillah, which is the standard Reform Siddur. for the Reform movement in North America. And actually, there is a version of Mishkan Tefillah used in the Southern Hemisphere, the English-speaking countries in the Southern Hemisphere as well. So a couple of things to note. You can see just from the picture a couple of really interesting things. So first of all, there's a Hebrew title, which doesn't get translated. So if you think about our past prayer books, right, we went from the Union prayer book, no Hebrew title, to Gates of Prayer, which had a Hebrew title, but nobody used it, to Mishkan Tefillah, which we use the Hebrew title. So that in and of itself is a huge shift. And in addition, the subtitle, I don't know if you can really see it there, but it's called a Reform Sidor, right? Untranslated. So that in and of itself represents, I think, a significant shift. The other thing is that this Sidor is only available Hebrew opening. I apologize if you hear the sirens in the background. I'm in Midtown Manhattan, and there's nothing I can do about that. So we used to have options, right? You used to be able to buy Gates of Prayer, either Hebrew opening or English opening, and this now is available only Hebrew opening. And that was an editorial decision, really, that was made when the book was in formation, that we were only going to have this one format, that a Sidor should open Hebrew opening. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, so here, this is also a huge innovation and sort of move in North American Reform liturgy, which is that the book, the Sidor, includes prayer for the state of Israel. And this is the first Reform Sidor in North America to do that, right? It was not in the Union Prayer Book, well, for obvious reasons, because that was originally published before 1948, but it was not in Gates of Prayer either. Now, Gates of Prayer certainly has references to the land of Israel, the state of Israel, but this is the first prayer book that's come out of the CCR that has the prayer for the state of Israel, or a version of the prayer for the state of Israel. And this is basically, from what I understand, the same version that was used in the conservative movement, and it's somewhat of an adaptation of what's used in Israel, but it's, a pretty standard Avinu Shebashamayim, and it's become now in many synagogues a standard part of the Torah service, or what happens after the Torah service. But it was, it doesn't seem so now anymore. But as it was being discussed and as the Sidor is being developed, this was a huge decision, and marks a sort of formal transformation in our liturgical approach to Israel. So let's move on. I guess actually, and we can just sit here for a minute with this slide, but I should also say that Mishkan Tefillah includes poetry, because if you're familiar with Mishkan Tefillah, right, so it's got the liturgical sort of the kava on the right side of the right-hand page. The left-hand page has the poetry or the alternative translations. Some of those are Hebrew poems in English, right? But that's, again, already sort of a I don't know if statement is the right word, but certainly a decision to include Hebrew poetry. Now we get to Mishkan HaNefesh, which is newer. It came after Mishkan Tefillah. It adopts many of the same principles as Mishkan Tefillah and then moves it even a little bit further. So just to sit with this slide for a minute, again, you see a Hebrew title, right? And it's not translated, it's transliterated, but it's not translated. What's the book called? What's the machzor called? It's called Mishkan HaNefesh. And again, the kind of subtitle is Machzor for the Days of Awe, not High Holiday Prayer Book or something like that. So again, there's a sort of specificity about those decisions. Also, it's only available Hebrew opening. So let's see how this works. Thank you. Okay, so now we went with the same sort of decision-making used in Mishkan Tefillah in terms of, again, the kind of the keva on the right-hand page, poetry on the left-hand page. And we went even a little bit further than Mishkan Tefillah. So we have Hebrew poetry, Here it's just broken down so it's easier to see. We have Hebrew poetry, but now we actually have it in the Hebrew as well as in the English. And part of the thinking here is if we're really encouraging people to learn Hebrew, to grapple with Hebrew, to love Hebrew, that we need to include the Hebrew alongside the English. We're not going to assume that most of our members, most of the people in our pews can read the Hebrew, but some will, some can, and some are learning, and some can connect even just to some of the words that are familiar, and also maybe even the sounds, and certainly the look. And so we wanted the Hebrew there. It's a very important kind of statement. Now the poetry itself is interesting too, because what you're going to see, and we don't have time to do a whole class in poetry, which would be really fun another time, but what you see here is a real variety in the kinds of poetry choices that were made. So this slide is so small on my computer that I can't see it, but yeah. Okay, so this is a poem by Sivan Harshefi. In other words, this isn't this isn't necessarily a familiar poem, right? It's not going to be in the kind of canon of like, oh, those Hebrew poems that we all know. We do have poetry, and you'll see in a moment, we do have Rachel and Leah Goldberg and Yehuda Amichai, but we also have poems that are much less familiar, but poems that we felt spoke to the themes and the same kind of yearnings, fears, whatever, hopes on the right side, in the keva. And so here we have this poem, again, unfamiliar, but felt very, very connected. So let's move on. We're just, we don't have time to really study the poems, but we'll take a quick look. And this one is Yehuda Amichai, more familiar, but also not one of his most familiar poems in terms of, I would say, North American Jews. There's some that we all know, and then some that are less familiar. I think that this is in that category. But again, and what you can see is the way the page is arranged is often there are two poems or two readings. In this case, we have Letter to a Humanist, which is not by Yehuda Amichai, not in the Hebrew, but we have this, and This Is Your Praise, which, again, we were able to include the Hebrew and the English, which is such a nice way to kind of bring people into some familiarity with Hebrew. Let's go on to the next one. And let's just go right to the bigger version of it. Thank you. And so this one is by Adi Assis. And again, a much less familiar poem, a less familiar poet to those of us in North America. And so part of what's happening here also, in addition to having just the visual of the Hebrew on the page and the attempt, to make sure that we're including a variety of Hebrew poets, is that we're also really introducing people to poets they might not know. And, that in and of itself could be a great thing if people then sort of remember a name, something intrigues them about the poet or the poem, and then they go and familiarize themselves with more of that poet's work. So there's sort of a little bit of a pedagogical kind of undertone to this effort. Let's go on to the next one. And yeah, thank you. And this one by Rachel, this is a much more familiar poem, The Tiny Joys. And, it just seemed like such a beautiful fit for the liturgy on the right side of the page, which unfortunately I didn't do this well. So you can't see what's on the right side of the page, but you can see by the Chatima on the bottom, that's under the poem. So that's the Chatima from the right side of the page, which gives you a sense of what the theme is, or kind of what's being addressed here, what's being explored. And this is very much a prayer book in which we're encouraging people to make their own way through the experience. So, please follow along with your rabbi and your cantor if that's what you want to do, but also take your time, go through it in your own way, focus on the left side of the page, read the poetry, really engage with the poetry if that's what's calling you in that moment. So, part of the effort of having all of these beautiful poems from Hebrew is to really give people a chance to explore language and text and ideas that might not be as familiar and that might open doorways back into the liturgy for them. Let's go on. Okay. And then what you see again, so we have the prayer for the state of Israel, just like in Mishkan Tefillah. And I think what I didn't do, can we look at the next slide, or is this the last slide? Yeah, all right, let's go back for a minute, sorry. What I meant to do and didn't do correctly is, so in addition to this now kind of standard version of the prayer for the state of Israel that we use, we also included some alternative versions. So we have a kind of creative version of a prayer for the state of Israel, not the prayer. And we also included, in one of the services, we included En Li Eretz Acheret, to kind of give a really different sense of Israel and our relationship to Israel. We didn't want to just say, this is the one way that we connect to the state of Israel through liturgy. There are options throughout the book. The last thing I'll just say is, thank you. So this is just a kind of footnote, but I thought it was important since we're talking about it. This, of course, is not liturgy, but this what you see in front of you is a front and a back of a book, right? So we see both sides of the cover. And what you're seeing here is something which was a really new kind of attempt for us, something which I think speaks a lot to the kind of ongoing relationship here at CCR with Hebrew and with Israel, is that we published this book in 2 languages. So we completely translated. It's a collection of essays. Some of the essays are by people in North America, some are by people in Israel, and actually I think a few in Europe as well. Every essay was translated into the other language. In other words, right, so the Hebrew essays were translated into English, English essays were translated into Hebrew. It's a completely bilingual edition, which, I think if we think about the early reformers here in North America, and, certainly the early rabbis of the CCR, I think they would maybe even be horrified, but they certainly would be very surprised to see such a publication coming out here. But it speaks to that attempt to engage with Israel, to engage with Hebrew, and to continue to sort of encourage ongoing learning of Hebrew, and to center the importance of Hebrew as our communal language, despite what other languages we may all speak. So I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really great intro. And I think we're going to come back to some of the themes that you started talking about in terms of the Hebrew language as well. So if we just can take the slideshows. There we go. Then I wanted to go, before we come to the Israeli, I wanted to go to Alexander, and just, I remember the first reaction that you had when I invited you to join us for this session was that you said, "Oh, but I'm not really sure I would describe myself as a Zionist." And we'll come back to the question that Yaron has posed. We'll keep that for the second part. Alexander, you said you're not quite sure how you would describe yourself as a Zionist, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you understand the references to Israel in the prayer book, how they are meaningful to you, and maybe your communities, and your community specifically in Luxembourg, but also the communities that you're familiar with.
Thank you, Leah. So I was a little bit surprised that I was invited to such a panel because I'm not really a Zionist person from the ideological standpoint. Of course, I support Artseinu because it's our movement's arm in the World Zionist Organization. It's very important to have representation there, but ideologically, I'm very far away from this. And when I see especially prayers that we just look very briefly on the screen the prayer for the state of Israel in Mishkan Tefillah and in conservative prayer books are not that interesting and for our discussion. It goes about Reshit Tzmichat Geuloteinu. Reshit Tzmichat Geuloteinu, and Mishkan Tefillah translates very tricky. So people who don't speak Hebrew would not find any problem probably there. So bless the state of Israel, which marks the dawning hope for all who seek peace. This is not Tzmichat Reshit Geuloteinu. And if I check the Mishkan Nefesh, suddenly there is another translation there, which says really what the Hebrew text says. Bless the state of Israel, first flowering of our redemption. So people who pray this, I guess they mean what they say. So when a person is a Zionist, I would understand why you're doing it. I mean, why Israel is, the establishment of Israel is understood as a step towards redemption. But if you live in the United States, if you're proud diaspora Jew or Jew living outside of Israel, how can you pray this with full heart? And the page before, you're praying for your country, our country, United States, which describes the United States as a haven for the persecuted, a beacon of hope among the nations. So one moment, is it the United States or Israel? What's exactly going on here? So, and this unspoken or undiscussed issue, I think it's very troubling, at least for me personally. So how can I be a Jew who lives outside of Israel and believes that it's nothing wrong about it? How can I be honestly saying, well, the state of Israel has a theological meaning. The re-establishment of the state of Israel has a theological meaning. It's a first step to redemption. It's in some prayer books, like in the French prayer book, it says it's a fulfillment of the prophetic promises. And we're thankful for this. How can I be then outside of this project? From the just very simple political and territorial point of view. So I think these are the tensions that I always feel when we talk about the prayer for Israel. But there are other references to Israel in the prayer book. In our prayer books, we don't really have much to say about the land of Israel. There's actually in more traditional prayer books, you probably find more about the land of Canaan and the land of Canaanites, and not the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. If you don't take the prayer for Israel, but the typical liturgy, Psukei de Zimra, for example, we have in the beginning of Psukei de Zimra in the Ashkenazi tradition, Hodu, there is a passage that reminds us of God's promise. To you, I will give the land of the land of Canaan as your allotted heritage. It's a quote from the Chronicles. There is also another quote, biblical quote reference to the land, the physical land, so to say, in the introduction to Shirat Hayam, to the Song of Songs, which is a quote from Book Nehemiah, and there's a reference to a covenant with Abraham to give to his descendants the land of the Canaanites, and so on and so forth. So if I am a liberal rabbi and a liberal Jew and living outside of the land, well, how can I read these statements in the liturgical settings? I'm not talking about the biblical studies. I'm not talking about other settings. I'm talking about the prayer book. So if I see these references in the prayer book, what do I do with it? So the only way that I can see it in a more metaphorical sense, because if it's really about the territorial claims, it will be absurd from the point of view of common sense and of international law to claim territory based on the Bible and all kinds of myths. And as liberal Jews, we understand that Bible is not just something that just was dropped from heaven. There is a certain history of its development. There are myths and so on and so forth that are part of it. So it's not necessarily a historical book. So the only way for me to see it as a meaningful reading is to see in the land of Israel, in references to Zion, to Jerusalem, to Eretz HaKodesh, land of holiness, or Holy Land, to try to imagine these terms as a metaphor. Metaphors in kind of utopian sense. Utopia means it's no place, it's not really existing in reality as a physical place. So they may refer to the Messianic times, they may refer to the state of liberation, getting home and feeling that you're at home. And I think this feeling can be also, this experience of Jerusalem, of Zion, of Israel, can be much more deeper than just traveling or settling the land, the physical parts of earth. And I would say the Holy Land, that it's a Kodesh, it's not necessarily a homeland. So it's a destination, it's a people, it's maybe ideal people are yearning to, but not necessarily the place where people say, well, this is my home. Because if this is my home and I live outside of it, so I have to explain why I'm living outside of it. If there is all possibilities in the world nowadays to buy a ticket and go there and live your life and be part of this collective experience. And just to make maybe to take one example of it, maybe example of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you can see also as a metaphor. Let's take one example, Psalm 122, which is used often in our liturgy. There's one verse there which says, "Yerushalayim abnuya ki'ir shechubrala yachdav," which can be translated, Jerusalem built up, a city knit together. So the way how to see this more in a metaphorical sense, of course, there are people who see it very literal as a justification for unification of the city, and the celebration for the Yom Yerushalayim, for example, is also part of the liturgy often. But to see it on a kind of more metaphorical sense of Jerusalem, to live the idea of Jerusalem is to recognize divine in everything. It's recognizing shlemut, recognizing wholeness in the world, and connecting to the verse I just mentioned, Jerusalem, city built up, city knit together. It's again reminds us of our commitment to see the world as a web of interconnected relationships, as something where we knit together to something bigger than we are, and when we are interconnected to each other. So, and I think actually, if we look through the history of Judaism, this kind of geographical or even anti-geographical connotation of liturgy is more widespread than we think nowadays, because we usually think, well, it's all about Zionism, it's all about the Jewish state, Jewish democratic state, hopefully. But I think there's much more there. So all these geographical terms like Jerusalem, Zion, land of Israel, they all also have other layers of meaning. But practically speaking, realistically speaking, I think it's very difficult to work with these metaphors nowadays, because of the sort of say proliferation of focus and on Israeli politics, what's going on there. I think it's very difficult to see behind this geographical or metaphors connected to geography, really metaphors, and not to see the geographical points. Just one example: when we say L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, the end of the Seder, next day in Jerusalem, I'm not sure, but I think the majority of people who hear this in the synagogue during the community Seder, they imagine Jerusalem and going to Jerusalem physically as the capital of Israel and Jerusalem of today. But actually, this understanding is also reinforced by Samagadot, where you have after this phrase, you have Atikva published. So it's very clear connection between Jerusalem and Zionist idea and going back to the homeland, so to say. So I'm not sure that using these metaphors really works further in the sense of metaphor, and people just don't see, first of all, the physicality of it. Practically speaking, I think I would rather choose other metaphors to convey the same message than to use these politically loaded or tricky, very often tricky and challenging metaphors, like Tzmichat Gevurteinu. What is that? And how do you explain it from a liberal stand for a proud Jew who lives outside of Israel?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that is actually, there's an interesting connection, because you, Alexander, spoke about Israel as a metaphor, and the Eretz HaKodesh more as a destination than a homeland. But Dalia, if we come to you as one of the co-editors of the Israeli Reform prayer book, for you, Israel is Eretz HaKodesh, maybe a destination, but certainly also a homeland. And we'd love to hear a little bit more from you about thinking about these tensions, maybe with the theological vision and the political reality of how they play out, but also thinking a little bit about kind of, and I'm going to combine a little bit my two questions that I thought we'd do in 2 rounds, but I think maybe we can do it together. Also thinking about what do we have to do in terms of the Hebrew language when we have a prayer book for Hebrew speakers, because as Alexander pointed out, sometimes us, the editors of liturgy that are going to be used primarily by people who do not speak Hebrew, have a little bit of an ability to fudge with the translation or to convey that metaphor. I think I don't like talking about the fudge. I think it's about conveying the depth of the metaphor in a different language, which is, translation is a very difficult task. It's not always a literal translation of words, whatever they might mean in the vocabulary now. But maybe, Dalia, I can hand over to you to share a little bit from the new prayer book, and a little bit also, of course, based on your research in liturgy and your work there.
So thank you very much. Shalom Rav from Jerusalem. Very, very happy to be here with you. We have a little problem because I'm not sure who is speaking with you right now. If it's Dalia the rabbi, or Dalia the liturgist, or Dalia the editor of prayer Sidur, or Dalia the worshipper. Yeah, I guess we will find out as we move along. What I would like to make a clear distinction, which is not so clear, between 2 things. When I think, Leah, you mentioned it at the beginning, but I want to make it clear, especially after what you said, Alex, and it was so engaging and interesting, and maybe we'll have time to engage in some conversation. I think we talk about 2 different things. We talk about Zion as the birthplace of the Jewish people, the place where our ancestors lived, the place where the temple was, the place where David built his city, etc. And we talk about Israel and the future for the future hopes, the hopes to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, whatever that means. Of course, it means something for us as Reformed Jews, and maybe something else for more traditional Jews. But the hopes for the future that connects this way or another with Zionism. And I can tell you, it's probably won't come as a surprise that when I talk about Israel or Zion, I talk about a very concrete place. Of course, it has symbolic meaning, but it also my home. It's where I pay my tax. It's where I went to the army, where my kids went to. It's a very concrete place. So this is how I relate to it. I want to take you on a very, very quick journey. It will converse a little bit with some of the things Hara showed before. I want to take you 200 years ago, actually 2,000 years ago, in a 3-minute journey, dealing with one passage in our prayer. Let's see if I can upload it. Yeah. So the changing attitudes toward Zion and Zionism in Reform liturgy, but we will begin much before the Reform liturgy. And what I'm talking about is the blessing of Avodah, which is the 17th blessing in the weekday 18 benediction, the Amidah. And on Shabbat, it's the 5th benediction. And all I want to discuss with you right now is the conclusion, the Chatima, the ending of the blessing, and how it evolved and changed throughout the ages, and what we can learn from it about the different attitudes towards Zion and Zionism. So originally there were two endings for these blessings. In the old Palestinian rite, the old Eretz Israel rite, which is lost to us, we can only find it in the Cairo Geniza, the conclusion was, Baruch atah she'odcha be'ir'a na'avod. Praise are you, etc., whom you alone we worship in awe. That was what the Jews in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, said. The Babylonian Jews said, Baruch atah hamachzir shchinato leTzion. Praised are you, yes, who returned his, gender, language, Shechina to Zion. Yeah. Now, today, all of us, and when I say all of us, I mean Ashkenazic and Sephardic and Yemenite and Italian, all of us, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, all of us are Babylonian Jews because the old Eretz Israel rite was lost. But let's see what was happening with this ending of these blessings. So when I look at old classical Reform prayer books, here I brought you an example of the most important German Reform rabbi, Abraham Geiger, and one of the most important American rabbis, David Einhorn, who's actually the father, if I can call it this way, or the grandfather of the Union prayer book that Hara was talking about. So they did not like very much this talking about God who returns God's Shekhinah, God's presence to Zion, right? Because they didn't want the centrality of Zion. We know that classical Reform Judaism was very reluctant to relate to Zion as the birthplace of the Jewish people, but it was even more reluctant or even hostile, I would say, in certain point, when it referred to Zion as a future place for the Jewish people. Instead, they chose the old Palestinian version, Baruch atah she'odcha levadcha be'ir'a na'avod. Praise are you, yes, whom you alone we worship in awe, because it speaks about ethical monotheism, and that was exactly what classical reformers liked so much. And when I moved to some slides were lost, but I would say that in the American liturgy, you see a gradual shift from the old Union prayer book that had this version that sort of takes Zion out of the picture to Gates of Prayer that sometimes edit, and we will see Mishkan Tfilah in a second. But before that, I want to show you the first Israeli Siddur. It is called Siddur Har'el. It was created in Keilat Har'el, beautiful Keilat Har'el in Jerusalem. And they restored the, I would say, traditional ending of the blessing, but they made it even more Zionist. So instead of talking about God who returns God's presence to Zion, they talk very deliberately about God who returns his people to Zion, right? So you can see in this Siddur or in general in the Israeli Reform Siddur, that it does not restore, it not just restores the traditional epithets and references to Zion and to what we can call Zionism and Jewish nationality, but it is even hyper-Zionist. It's more Zionist than the traditional, what you may call Orthodox Siddur. Later on, in the Siddur Ha'avodah Shebalev, that served us so well for almost 40 years, here you have Baruch Atah HaMachzir Shchinato Ve'amo LeTzion. So they took what Siddur Har'el did, referring to the people of Israel, but they also restored the reference to the Shekhinah, to God's presence in Zion. And then Siddur Mishkan Tfilah, that Hara already spoke about. In most places, they include the Babylonian version, Machzir Shchinato LeTzion, which is considered to be, if not Zionist, then pro-Zionist. But sometimes they also have the old Palestinian rite, talking about God to whom alone we worship in awe. In the new Machzor that Hara was mentioning, Mishkan HaNefesh, they also have the Babylonian version, HaMachzir Shchinato LeTzion, but the translation is somewhat different. Blessed are you, whose divine presence is felt again in Zion. And that goes back to the question of translation. I always tell my students there is no such thing as faithful or loyal translation, because how can you be loyal when you translate? It's all a very, very metaphorical language. And here comes our Siddur, Tfilat Ha'adam. We were supposed to inaugurate it last May in the IMPJ biennial, and the IMPJ biennial, as you know, did not happen because of the global pandemic crisis. We're hoping to get the last draft on Sunday and send it right to the printing house, God willing. So hopefully we will be there. What we did in Tfilat Ha'adam is we copied the text that you find in the older Israeli Reform Siddur. That is to say, including God's presence and also his people. But if you can see, I don't know if you can see it very clearly, the word Amo, the word his people, is in a grayish color to show you that this is not the traditional text. But we also did something that no other Israeli Siddur did before, as far as I know. We also included the old Palestinian, the old Eretz Israel version, that is to say, blessed are you, O God, to whom alone we worship in awe. First, because we thought it's a very good text, referring to the ethical monotheism that we are experiencing, that we're practicing. But we also wanted to give place to the old or classical Israeli liturgy that you can find. Oh, how do I stop sharing? Am I sharing it yet? No, that's it. All right. So we also wanted to give place to the old Eretz Israel, the old Palestinian version that you have in that tefillah. Do I still have 2 more minutes, or am I out of time? 2 more minutes. So let me show you some of the things that we did in the new Israeli Siddur. So this is the cover, Tfilat Ha'adam, the prayer of the individual, the prayer of the human, taken from the song of Chana Senesh, which is very important to text to Israelis. Let me skip a little bit because we don't have so much time. All right. So here we have the blessing of the second blessing before the Shema recitation. So instead of saying "V'tolichenu komemiyut le'artzenu," bring us forth with might to our land, we say "V'tolichenu komemiyut be'artzenu," in our land. So we refer in this Siddur to the fact that we are in Israel. Another thing, we will not have time to explore it. We included a lot of Israeli, Jewish in general, but a lot of Israeli poetry, and we wanted to be as inclusive as possible when it comes to the different edot, the different ethnic groups. We wanted to include all of them in the text. And for example, you can see that we included the entire Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, which is a custom in Sephardic and Hasidic communities, because we all know that the Reform Siddur is basically a European endeavor. It's an Ashkenazic endeavor, but here in Israel, where we live in a 50-50 kind of situation with Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews, and many of us are mixed, like myself, we wanted everyone to feel at home in the Siddur, so we included Shir HaShirim, we included a lot of passages from both Siddurim. The last thing that I want to share with you right now is in the Kabbalat Shabbat service, we include a whole section of Shabbat songs that relate to different parts of Israel. So we have Bikat Ginosar, and we have the Jezreel Valley, and we have Jerusalem, and et cetera, et cetera. So I will stop now. There's a lot more to say. Maybe we will get to it in the discussion.
Wonderful. And I know Alexander also has a question. But I just want to take a short moment to talk a little bit about the new Siddur that we're working on in the UK, because I think it picks up on some of the things that were already mentioned. It's still very much a work in progress.
And I apologize for not including it in my presentation. I just don't have it yet. So,
absolutely, sorry. We're not yet there. But I wanted to share a little bit with you, and there are some things that where we follow on from previously. So in terms of the title, we are Siddur, also in the English, but that we were already that with Siddur Lev Chadash. So we're following on from Siddur Lev Chadash. Our working title at the moment, but I think we're going to stick with it, is Siddur Shira Chadasha. We chose the name. We had a lot of discussions about the name. Rabbi Eli Tikva, Sarah, my co-editor, and I, and we haven't had any objections from our colleagues, so I think that's why we're going to stick with it. We wanted some continuity of our existing Siddur and our Machzor. Our Siddur is Lev Chadash, our Machzor is Ruach Chadasha, so we wanted to capture that Chadash sense still. And we wanted to talk a little bit about it being Shira, being about poetry, because we loved the fact that there was poetry parallel to the text in Mishkan Tefillah and Mishkan HaNefesh. And we're experimenting with that. I'm not going to talk about that right now because it's not, although we are also including Hebrew poetry. And one of our big discussions at the moment is about not so much whether we include the Hebrew text with the Hebrew poetry, but whether we should include transliterations with the Hebrew poetry. Because one of the things we decided to do is that we would have, for every text that we present, we would have the Hebrew, the English, and the transliteration. And we've done a lot of playing around. And at the moment, it looks like we are actually going to be a landscape Siddur, which is going to be an interesting challenge in terms of the book format. It might not prove to be a challenge because with the COVID age, now everyone is familiar with using prayer books on their devices, and people have got much more familiar with landscape. So we might not have that challenge. But what we really wanted to do is we wanted to put the Hebrew central. That was a real endeavor of ours. We wanted to include transliteration. It will be the first liberal prayer book from the UK that includes transliteration. We wanted to include transliteration, but we wanted the Hebrew text to be in the center. The example that I've chosen here for you is a good example because it symbolizes two things. First of all, in our Torah service in Lev Chadash, we didn't talk about Zion. Even the phrase Mitzion Tetzei Torah, we had it in one of the Torah services, but not in most of them. This time we decided to include an adapted version of Av HaRachamim, but in the feminine. And that's one of the other things that we've decided with the new prayer book in the UK, is that we said we want to do the same things in the Hebrew language that we feel we have done and we are doing in the English. Now, Lev Chadash already was sort of gender neutral English, but the Hebrew was fully masculine. Now, there isn't really a good Hebrew, gender neutral Hebrew. And so we've decided to combine the masculine and the feminine, and to vary, to have different services where we use different passages of addressing God, also with feminine metaphors. And I think for me that was an important it was an important Zionist message. It was also a message about social justice and what does it mean about our image of God. And I always talk, when people challenge me, like, why do we need a masculine image of God? I always say, there used to be the days when we said, you can be everything, but to a girl, you can be everything, but you can't be a rabbi. Well, if we just have God addressed in the masculine, it still presents that kind of hierarchy. And until women have the same kind of levels of self-esteem growing up, there's still a lot of work to do. That's, for me, the social justice argument. But for me, there was also a Zionist element in this, and that I wanted the prayer book to also be authentic, to feel authentic to me in the Hebrew language, not just in the translation. And that I feel in my own imagery, I don't see God as this genderless masculine God, but see God in many metaphors, and some of them also being feminine. And so we decided to give a variety of images of God. This is also something that Mishkan Tefillah started off. Reform liturgy or liberal liturgy used to be very clear about its theology. There was one theology that we all had to follow. What we've decided on purpose is that there will be many theologies, and that's also the case in Mishkan Tefillah, but it was really important for us that there would be this multivocality. So I just wanted to share that. We have very little time, so I'm going to ask the slides to come back down, because I know Alexander wanted to ask a question. So we have the question about Sephardi liturgy also. Maybe Hera can answer that very quickly, but and then go over to Alex for his question. So maybe Hera, just very quickly on the Sephardi liturgy.
Yeah, we do. So Mishkan HaNefesh has a good bit of Sephardi piyutim that were either were never in Reform liturgy in North America before, or might have sort of shown up here or there, but we brought back a lot that the early reformers took out of the Machzor, and also found some other interesting things that are happening in terms of the kind of re-exploration of piyutim that's going on right now in Israel. We looked a lot at that, and there are some beautiful piyutim throughout the book that do fit into what Yaron is asking about. So I would suggest just look through the 2 volumes of Mishkan HaNefesh, and you'll see some beautiful kind of re-engagement with some of those ancient piyutim, and in beautiful new translation, and in most cases, not all, but in most cases, the Hebrew is there as well.
Question.
So my question is actually not very simple and probably too long, but it just may be a rhetorical question. What I'm missing in the discussion is what's the theological message of these books? I mean, technically speaking, this and that, there are several different formulations from the history of the prayers. As a liturgist, of course, you would explain it this way. But I'm just thinking about the Avodah blessing that Dalia took as an example. if we say Machazi Shinato Letzion, what do we mean by this? Do we mean that God's presence is not in Zion, or there is a place in the world that is not that is void of God's presence? What do we want to say with this? So going beyond of technicalities, of course, there is a beautiful melody for this, and we can sing it together in the synagogue. But what is the theological message behind it? And how do we coordinate it with other messages that we have in the Siddur?
So,
Leah, I think that we need a part two.
I think we do need
this,
a part two for this. I
Yeah.
absolutely think we need a
Yeah,
part
yeah.
two for this. Before I come to Dalia, so I'll come to you, Dalia, last because you're going to share with us our closing as well. So I'm going to, I think for me, Alex, I'm going to give you the quick answer. I think for me, the theological message is what every reader finds in it. And I think there are many theological messages that are encapsulated in our prayer books. And I'm definitely, I'm a break in the liberal liturgical tradition, in the sense that I do not believe that prayer, that we should only say what we believe. I always say this to my congregation quite a lot, is if I should only say what I believe, I wouldn't be left with much to pray for. Because part of prayer is to express that which is beyond what I can reason with. So I think there are many messages, but I'm going to hand over to Dalia, who is also going to share something to leave us with, because we only have 3 minutes left. So Dalia, over to you.
All right. So obviously, your great question cannot be answered. I would just say that it is a very Jewish thing. You know, Jewishly, you don't have these theological tractates about liturgy. The theology is embedded in the liturgy. Yeah, it's out there, right? But it can be understood in more than one way. This is a difference between, I would say, mainstream Judaism and Protestant Christianity. Yeah, so I don't think that there is no theological statement here. I think there are very profound theological statements, but they're just not overt because we don't do it this way. I know that I don't like when people say Jews don't do it, because then I will always find the opposite example. But I think Jewishly, we just don't do that. We don't talk in an explicit, overt theological language. But Leah, you know, my Yeke genes will not allow me to continue talking about it, although I really want to. Leah asked me to conclude with a prayer, and one of the prayers that we included in Tfilat Adam is a prayer for meetings or encounters between Israeli Jews and Jews that are outside the state of Israel. And we were asking ourselves, what should be the text? And then we found the opening passage of the second book of Maccabees. And the second book of Maccabees begins with a prayer that the Jews in Judea sent to their brothers and sisters in the diaspora, in that sense, in Alexandria, in Egypt. And we sort of revised it a little bit to make it more, ideologically apt. But here's the text, and it's only in Hebrew now. I will read it and translate it, but I can tell you the good news is that we're working on a translation. The Chin Foundation sponsors a translation for the book in English. And again, just to go back to Leah's initial question, our issue with liturgy is I would say more severe than other communities, because we understand the text. The holy language is also the vernacular. So we cannot hide behind nice and empowering and ideologically adequate translations. We have the text in front of us, and it has to make sense. Anyway, the prayer that I was referring to, it's the same page as the prayer for people who convert. You see, for a woman and for a man who convert to Judaism. And here, this is the prayer for the encounter with Israeli communities from the diaspora. So you can see that it comes from the point of view of Israeli Jews. אחינו ואחיותינו בתפוצות, שלום וישרה. To our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, shalom and abundant of salvation. אדוני אלוהים יברך אתכם ויזכור לכם את בריתו, את אברהם ושרה, את יצחק ורבקה, את יעקב ורחל ולאה. May the eternal, our God, remember you, bless you, and remember for you God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. I skip a little. יפתח אדוני לבבכם, להגות בתורתו ולשמור מצוותיו, וייתן לכם ברכה ושלום. May the eternal open your hearts to meditate on God's Torah and to consider God's, or to observe God's commandments and give you blessing and peace. May God hear your prayer and have compassion over you. And may God save you and deliver you from any trouble and pain. זאת תפילתנו בעדכם כל הימים. This is our prayer for you every day, all days. ונאמר amen. Let us say amen. I think this is suitable every time, but every day, but especially now with the pandemic. So this is our prayer for you and for all of us. תודה רבה.
And to that we say amen. And to all of our listeners, if you do want to have an opportunity to use the prayer book tomorrow, then do join us Israeli time 6 p.m. for Kabbalat Shabbat. We're inviting you all to join Ohel Avraham and a number of other Reform synagogues from Israel to join us for a special tefillah. I think Dalia will be with us as well. And you will be able to see some of the new prayer book in use then as well. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you to everyone who's been commenting and sending questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them. We probably need part 2, but have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.